This week's module brings us into the 20th century. If we reflect on the periods dealt with in the previous modules, the first 5 have us think about a period of revolution, and the next 4 a period of social and technological transformation. Final modules illustrate how these two trends came together in the 20th century, often with catastrophic results. This week's module focuses on the Great War, also known as World War I, to investigate how the transformation of war destroyed notions of progress and forced a reconsideration of the notion of civilization.
The origins of the Great War are, like other historical phenomena, complex, and we might think about them as on 5 axes. Each one highlights conditions that led to war, and in particular how the war was conducted. They are military, diplomatic, internal politics, terrorism, and cultural anxieties. The combination of these factors contributed to the general outbreak of war in 1914. In terms of military factors, there were 2 major ones. The first was the development of general staffs, military planning committees, on all major European states. These organizations were concerned with military planning and conducting war. The German General Staff was presented with the potential problem of fighting a war on 2 fronts, with both the French and the Russians. Schlieffen, one of the German General Staff, devised a plan that would defeat the French army in 6 weeks, which would allow the German army to turn its attention to the Russians. However, the plan called for the expansion of a possible war, as it involved the invasion of several other countries. Yet this was the plan that the Germans had. The second major military factor was an arms race, which had developed out of imperialism. All of the major powers, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Italy, Austria-Hungary, and the United States, began amassing weapons, including dreadnoughts as shown here, to show military strength. Additionally, France and Germany extended the required length of conscription from 2 to 3 years, enlarging their armies in the 1910s. The diplomatic factor was certainly the development of an alliance system, as shown here. The Triple Alliance was Germany, Italy, and Austria, while the Triple Entente was Britain, France, and Russia. The breaking of Europe into 2 camps suggested that war was imminent. But terrorism also played a factor. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a multi-ethnic state dominated by 2 groups, Germans and Hungarians. Other groups, Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, and Czechs, just to name a few, had pretensions to independence from Austria-Hungary, as nationalism became a powerful force. These desires manifested themselves in terrorist organizations seeking to disrupt the Austro-Hungarian Empire in order to free different groups. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand, pictured here, was the heir to the throne, and he became a target during a visit to Sarajevo in June of 1914. The Black Hand, a group dedicated to the creation of a Greater Serbia that included all Serbs, planned an attack against the Archduke. One of its operatives, Gavrilo Princip, pictured here, was part of an assassination attempt against Franz Ferdinand. Princip was able to kill the Archduke despite the Black Hand's plan failing. The death of the Archduke set in motion all of the other factors previously discussed, as Austria-Hungary discovered links between the Black Hand and the government of Serbia, and demanded that Serbia allow Austria-Hungary to invade to capture the terrorist organization. Serbia, however, had a powerful ally in Russia, while Austria-Hungary's ally Germany backed a strong response against Serbia. The mobilization of armies following the assassination of Ferdinand illustrates the last factor. When the call for mobilization went out to European states, young men quickly responded by signing up in droves. Entire classes of college students left school to join the army, and volunteers showed up for muster in nearly every country. Nationalism was a large factor here. The potential for war was also perceived as a way for dealing with the social problems of the 19th century, alcoholism and disease. War would be a cleansing process in this case. When the Schlieffen Plan failed to defeat the French, both sides began to dig trenches to wait for new plans. Also, both sides had assumed a short war and immediately ran low on supplies. The trenches became a complex system that suggested that a long war was coming. Because of the failure of previous plans and the inability for regular tactics to break the trenches, both sides turned to new types of weapons to change the stalemate that had developed by 1915. Neither side could make a decisive attack, so these new weapons were believed to be the answer. These included tanks and chemical weapons. However, neither side used these effectively, and often these types of weapons disrupted their own attacks. Aerial bombardment was another approach that both sides believed could change the war. Here we have an aerial photograph of Passchendaele, a French town from prior to 1914. In the photo, you can see the roads and buildings in the town square. And here is the same town in 1916, where all traces of the town have been obliterated. Yet aerial bombardment did not make a difference in changing the war, and indeed only expanded its destruction. The war continued into 1916, and by then the Germans had developed a new plan. Previously, war plans that had involved the capture of opponents' capitals. In 1916, the Germans wanted to create so-called meat grinders in an attempt to destroy the French army, in essence to kill as many soldiers as possible in order to win the war. Two battles from 1916, Verdun and the Somme, illustrate the human cost of these new tactics. At Verdun, the Germans retreated, forcing the French to follow. The battle that followed lasted nearly 10 months, and the French were bombarded constantly. Nearly 500,000 casualties followed, and the French army was seriously threatened. In order to help their allies, the British attacked at the Somme, in order to weaken the German army. However, the British losses there were catastrophic, losing nearly 50,000 men on the first day of battle. These new tactics only increased the death count of the war without changing it decisively. This slide shows soldiers crossing no man's land and attempting to storm the trenches. This tactic, the frontal assault, was the main French tactic throughout the war, despite its failure and human cost. Known as Plan 17, the military tactic never changed and caused problems for the French army as the war continued. These problems manifested themselves in 1917 when the French army decided to launch the Nivelle offensive, a variation of Plan 17. When the French soldiers received word of the plan, portions of the French army refused to follow orders, which were certain death, and instead formulated a mutiny against the French general staff. In all, 46 divisions refused to attack, in essence dooming the offensive. The French army came down hard on the mutineers, court-martialing 23,000 soldiers. But the revolts illustrated that the offensive capabilities of the French army, worn down both by German attacks and the French general staff's reliance on poor tactics, were gone. The war ended in 1918 with a revolution in Germany. The new German government sued for peace, although Germany still occupied French territory and had held against the renewed Allied offensive and had defeated the Russians already. The end of the war brought two new crises in Europe. One, a demographic crisis, and two, a crisis of civilization. The first was a product of the magnitude of death and dismemberment as a result of the war. 1.5 million British, 3 million French, 4 million Germans. These figures were coupled with deaths from diseases that followed the war, particularly a strand of Spanish influenza that was a global epidemic in 1919. There was a brief decline in birth rates as a result, which caused great anxiety in Western societies concerned with rebuilding after the war. Coupled with this was the continued presence of women in the labor force, a trend that had increased during the war and that has caused cultural critics to decry how women needed to stay home to help repopulate states. In terms of the crisis of civilization, critics again pointed to how Western civilization's alleged superiority was challenged by the reality of the war. Also, the traumas of the war, dismemberment and shell shock, suggested a frailty that had not been understood to be part of war. Lastly, the failure of war to end decisively caused problems among states, even as Germany would be punished.